Well, welcome to you all. This is the 13th seminar of Global Sociology Live, and this is the next to the last seminar. The last seminar will be an attempt to think through what we have learned over the last semester, if we've learned anything, whether we've moved forward or backward in the understanding of the meaning of global sociology. And during the semester, we have covered virtually all parts of the world, with one very key exception, Latin America. So that is, of course, why, one of the reasons, there are many reasons, one of the reasons why we have with us today, we're lucky to have with us today, César Rodriguez-Garavito. And he comes to us from the University of Andes in Bogota, in Colombia, where he is a professor, and also, most importantly, he is the founder and director of the program of Global Justice and Human Rights. So it is a very great pleasure we welcome you here today, Cesar, taking a stance from Latin America. Now, it's particularly important because we had a great time discussing your article, ethnicity.gov, on Monday. And one of the interesting features of that article was it actually gave us a whole new vision of what global sociology might be. We had been discussing the idea of the counter-movement. And what your article offered us was a different view of what we might mean by the counter-movement, since you were talking very much, as you do in much of your work, of course, about the rights of indigenous populations and how they get absorbed in what you called a socio-legal field, or actually called a social minefield, very much a minefield, which incorporated not just the indigenous community and its representatives, but NGOs, transnational corporations, the state, and beyond the state to what the ILO, International Labour Office, and also the United Nations. What we actually termed on Monday the sort of the left hand of the political order of, you smile, the left hand of the political order of the world, as opposed to the right hand, which we discussed earlier with Walden Bello, the IMF, WTO, and World Bank. And so what was interesting is that you actually, in the process, you sort of, I think, called into question the very idea of the counter-movement and of what Peter Evans calls, and others call, and in fact you do sometimes, counter-hegemonic globalization. Because I think that what you were arguing there is that actors get incorporated into a vertical field, and the struggle is on the terrain of that field, on the terrain of a global hegemony, rather than in opposition to a global hegemony, which is how we've thought about the counter-movement before. So I think you opened up a whole new vista by looking at the fate of indigenous movements and their struggles. You also recalled to us, of course, the work of David Harvey, brought us back to David Harvey's idea of accumulation through dispossession. You remember that? Accumulation through dispossession. And also it brought, therefore, you brought your rich history and your research into human rights, racism, and the legal order of the world to the central focus for this course, which was something new for us. So we now look forward to listening to you for 15 minutes, and then we will have a discussion, and we'll see where we go with it. Okay, so welcome, César.
Actually, I feel like I have nothing else to say. You summarized my argument so well that it's just a hard act to follow, but I'll try. I'd like to begin by thanking Michael, the Berkeley Sociology Department, the ISA for the invitation, and also for pursuing this really exciting experiment. One that I think finally comes to terms with the issues of global sociology. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I hear some noise?
There's some interference, but you just keep on going. I think it's writing itself.
Okay. So what I was saying is that through the use of these tools of information technology, there is, I think, much potential for global engagement on these and other issues. And actually, now that you're webcasting and recording and posting this online free, I think it's going to be a lot easier to teach these global sociology courses. I, for one, plan to just hit play with the videos that you guys have produced, and then stand with my students in Bogota and then watch all the videos next semester. Yeah. So.
Good. Well, we'll do the same for you. You should. We'll follow your course too, and we'll all learn Spanish.
We should do that. So about the topic, my presentation today is based on the paper that Michael was alluding to, which was published in the Indiana Journal of Global Legal Studies just recently, that deals with the explosion of socio-environmental conflicts around the world. Mostly Latin America, the region where I focused in the paper is Latin America, but this is really going on in different places. I taught a similar course on these issues in South Africa just a couple of months ago, and everyone was talking about similar issues. Of course, mining in South Africa has been going on for 1.5 centuries or so, but this is exactly the exact type of conflicts, basically pitting large development concerns, those companies and states pursuing large development projects, be it mining operations or the construction of large dams, or the construction of infrastructure, like roads and bridges and ports and so on and so forth, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a series of social groups, all the way from indigenous peoples to peasant communities to marginalized communities which have been affected by these large development projects. And of course, we just had the anniversary of the oil spill in the U.S., which sort of brought to the public, the global public's attention, the salience and the importance and the risk associated with this type of economies. But this is happening, of course, also in places that are much less visible than the U.S. Gulf. And these are the places, some of the places that I've visited and have done field work on. So just to give you a sense, a flavor for the salience and the urgency of this issue, just a month ago, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights ordered the Brazilian government to suspend the construction of what would be the largest dam in Brazil, which will be located in northeastern Brazil, in the Amazon, the Belo Monte Dam. That's where James Cameron took Arnold Schwarzenegger for a tour, and where this is the case where supposedly the sequel to the Avatar movie will be based. Well, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights asked the Brazilian government to stop the construction of that particular project until, and the reason was that it found that the Brazilian government had not consulted with the local indigenous people as per ILO Convention 169. And let me just say a word about ILO Convention 169 because it'll come up in the presentation once and again. This is a legal instrument, a treaty, that was issued by the ILO in 1989, that basically asks states to consult with indigenous peoples before authorizing the construction of these type of projects in their territories. Most Latin American states have ratified ILO Convention 169, so they're legally bound by it. Other countries around the world, like Nepal, have ratified it too, but it's mostly Latin America that has been adopting this on a cascade, one country after the other. And that's why cases like the Belo Monte Dam have proliferated over the last 15 years in Latin America. Another very well-known one took place and is going on still in Guatemala. The Marlin mine in Guatemala was also the object of a legal case before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which also ordered the suspension of that particular mining project. That was a gold operation by Goldcorp, a corporation based in Canada. And then we have a Peruvian in the class, and of course that's the Bagua case. That's a location in the Peruvian Amazon that became the center of the dispute, very violent dispute between the indigenous organizations and the state forces in the army, in that case, and the police in Peru. And that became, and is still, I would argue that it's still one of the big structural conflicts in Peruvian society, pitting a government that is intent on pursuing the mining route to development. And as you may know, Peru has had growth rates that are have been higher than China's in some years over the last decade, precisely by opening the door to investment on mining concerns. So this is in some an ongoing and so multi-sided conflict that takes place around Latin America and other places in the world. The case study that I do in the paper that I'm presenting on today is on a big dam project in northwestern Colombia, the Urrá Dam. And that takes place and taking place in what I would call the headquarters of the armed paramilitary movement around the world. That's where the paramilitary movement in Colombia was born. And that, as you may know, is one of the most violent and strongest right-wing paramilitary movements in the world, and still around. So this is one reason why I call these particular locations social minefields. And I call them social minefields both in literal and metaphoric terms. Literally because they are built around or revolve around mining concerns, a mine. And also in the case of Urrá, when we would go there and do field work, we could move around freely because the territories around the dam have been planted with anti-personnel landmines by the Colombian guerrilla movement, the FARC, and before that the ELN. So this gives you a sense of the volatility, the risk, the immense risk that is associated with frontier economies of this type. And also I mean it in metaphorical terms, in sociological terms, as social minefields. These are social fields in which specific types of sociabilities, power asymmetries, and legal relations are established. And this is what I'm trying to get at through this project and the field work that I've been conducting. So how is it connected? I'll say a couple of words about the connection between that project and the idea of global sociology, and then I'll focus on a very short version of the arguments, and then I'll end to open up the session for discussion. Well, it has connections with global sociology and globalization in many obvious ways. For example, this is happening in many places around the world, and it's also connected to issues having to do with the global commons, with the environment. Issues that are not easily divided up into national state concerns and operations. So whether or not the Amazon survives as a biodiversity haven is something that affects not only Peru or Brazil, but the whole world. So in that sense, it is intrinsically global as an issue. But also in less obvious ways, my argument in my work is that the clash and these socio-environmental conflicts result from the clash of two global projects. And I use the term projects in Phil McMichael's sense, meaning a loose association, a loose network of different actors pushing roughly in the same direction and coming together to produce legal, social, and political networks that clash with other networks of the same time, but advocating different agendas. And the two global projects that I focus on are, on the one hand, extractive capitalism, and there are structural socioeconomic forces at play. I'll just refer to this by quoting the Financial Times last year, had a really nice piece that showed that we're in the midst of what's called metals super cycle. That is the booming demand, basically triggered by the growth of China as a global economic superpower. And then on the other hand, stagnant supply of metals, of such valuable things like coal, like gold, like coltan, the coltan that fuels and that we use in the cell phones and so on and so forth. And according to those figures published by the Financial Times, we had not been in such a period since the late 19th century, in the times of the gold rush in the U.S., when the U.S. was taking off. And so this type of extractive capitalism, the dynamic, the speed and the strength of this type of extractive capitalism we hadn't seen for a while, at least for a century, which has had paradoxical consequences for development, for the sociology of development and for public policy in the global south. Well, just as these countries in the 1980s and 1990s were being told by the IMF, by the World Bank, to open up their economies and industrialize themselves, well, all of a sudden, the new route to development is through commodities. The very same raw materials that were supposed to be the past of Latin America and the global south. And we now have all these countries going through a mining boom and metals boom. And this is why I used the work of David Harvey here, who argues, rightly I think, that we're going back to times of primitive accumulation in Marxist terms. That is, the expansion of the frontiers of capitalism that which has a key effect of pushing out the communities and the organizations and the peoples who had been already pushed to the margins of global capitalism. And this is why I focus on indigenous peoples. Those places that I've been to doing field work are those that nobody wanted just 20 years ago. Those are the areas where these communities, ethnic communities, have been pushed out. I've also done some field work in Afro-descendant communities on the Colombian Pacific and the Peruvian and the Ecuadorian communities, Pacific coast, and the story is the same. And these frontiers are now in the process of being incorporated in these extractive commodity supply chains that I referred to. But on the other hand, unlike in the times of the gold rush in the U.S. and the time of the late 19th century, there's an international human rights system, and there are international human rights movements. And this is a key piece that is the second part of my story. And I focus on indigenous people's rights because this is the specific social group that has been most impacted, at least in the countries that I've been looking at: Colombia, Peru, Guatemala, Ecuador to a lesser extent, and also because the indigenous rights movement has gained salience at the transnational level, basically by aligning itself with environmental organizations. So this is sort of a socio-environmental movement pushing back the movement for the expansion of the frontiers of global capitalism. And let me just finish the presentation of the indigenous rights movement by mentioning another keystone of the movement. So the first one was the 1989 ILO Convention on Prior Consultation, and the second one is more recent. It's the 2009 UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, which resulted from a 15-year discussion within the UN on how to create some sort of soft law mechanism for protecting and for granting the claims and for hearing the claims of the indigenous movement that had been that indigenous organizations had been making for 25 years now. Let me wrap up by saying a couple of words about the key arguments in the paper. Because of this, of the legalization, one of the arguments I make in the paper is that this process and the clash of these global projects has meant what Jean and John Komarov have called the legalization of transnational mobilization. What does that mean? It means that many of these conflicts are taking place through legal means, through legal institutions. Thus the rise of international declarations, treaties, international tribunals. This is why the Belamonte Dam case has been decided so far, or is the process being decided by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and this is why the UN Rapporteurship on Indigenous Peoples' Rights has been so active on all these cases, and this is why also the reason also why when you go to these social minefields, much of the talk you hear, if you listen carefully, is not about it's as much about development and culture as it is about procedures and legal procedures. So, and this is the figure of prior consultation. So many of the indigenous organizations around the world are making claims in very legalistic terms. And prior consultation is a liberal administrative mechanism whereby you basically, as an affected community, ask the state that the state set up a procedure of hearings, of notice, of appeals, whereby you have a voice in whatever is being decided that might affect you. In this case, the beginning of large development projects. And so what I did and I'm still doing in the project is tracking down these global processes at the different venues where it takes place, all the way from the Urrá Dam in the Colombian jungle to the offices of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights to the Geneva offices of the UN Rapporteurship on Indigenous Rights. So, and this is the type of methodology that I've been using, following George Marcus's idea of multi-sited ethnography, which is fascinating, but I also can tell you that it's pretty exhausting. Let me just end by saying something about the idea of ethnicity, and I leave the questions on the effects of prior consultation, on the actual impact of all these processes on indigenous peoples for the question and answer period. I call the legalization of these claims ethnicity.gov in an explicit, deliberate attempt at engaging with what anthropologists Jean and John Komarov have called ethnicity.inc in a book that's entitled ethnicity.inc. Wonderful book that argues that indigenous peoples and other ethnic communities have gone through a process in which, in order to survive, they have to create a brand, basically, to sell something that is their own. They say literally in the book. The ecotourism, intellectual property over traditional knowledge, and so on and so forth. Well, my argument is that parallel to that economic process, and at the same time, there has been a socio-legal project that I call ethnicity.gov. And I play with the internet conventions that I would call their project ethnicity.com, mine would be ethnicity.gov. But the suffix gov, in my argument, does not stand for government, but for governance. Because this is a story of not just states and interstate organizations like the UN or the ILO regulating ethnicity and socio-environmental conflicts, but also about a host of different actors, all the way from transnational corporations to international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. They have very sophisticated guidelines. They're called operational guidelines on indigenous peoples. Both the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank have developed operational guidelines that basically have incorporated the standards of ILO Convention 169. So the idea of prior consultation has been incorporated into neoliberal legality. As Waldenbell spoke in this course about that particular side of globalization, well, they've embraced prior consultation. But if you also look at the website of the International Mining Association, the name is escaping me, but this is the association, the business association of the largest mining companies around the world. Well, they also have a code of conduct on indigenous people's rights that incorporates prior consultation. So it is this pluralistic, internally contradictory process that I call ethnicity.gov. And that process has paradoxical effects, both empowering and disempowering, that I can discuss and elaborate on in the discussion session, because I think my time is up, right?
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Very good. Well, you're just telling us really how complicated global sociology can get. Indeed. So we have somebody who's really sort of deeply embedded in it. So who would like to start the questioning?
So if I could just say one thing.
Yes.
I'm being told, Cesar, that the technological problems with the sound are only coming because when your computer begins to fall asleep, so as long as you touch it every few minutes to keep it awake, that we don't have problems with the sound.
What's it to do with the computer? He's not. You're not Skype. He's in a video conferencing. No. Don't worry, we're doing fine. Anyway, you know, there's always problems in communicating north and south, right? Okay, very good. Now, who would like to begin? Come on. Lale, why don't you begin?
Yeah. So actually, Cesar, I would like to ask you a question kind of specifically coming out of the article that we read, ethnicity.gov. And I get that one of the arguments you're trying to make is that the absorption of these mobilizations or these struggles around indigenous rights into this legal field simultaneously, has the potential of reproducing unequal power relations and furthering forms of dispossession, but that at the same time it also holds some kind of potential for resistance. And so in that piece, you lay out what you say are the ultimate effects of these legal processes of consent and or consultation. And three of those effects are things like, domination and displacement and miscommunication. And then at the end, we get the effect of an emancipatory effect. And I think that there's definitely more of an emphasis in the piece, at least, on illustrating for us the ways in which these procedures actually come to reproduce those unequal relationships and enable forms of dispossession, and a lot less elaboration of their potential for actually enabling forms of resistance. So I was hoping maybe you could elaborate a little bit on what you see as the possibilities actually within these processes. And I was also a little confused as to why you call it an emancipatory effect, because the image we get in the paper is one in which, at most these procedures allow for slowing down these processes, right? And so what emancipatory potential do you actually see in them?
Should I go ahead?
Absolutely, Cesar. We're waiting.
Okay.
We've been waiting for 4 days for the answer to this question.
It's funny. Thanks for the question. It's key, and one that's key not only for the argument but also for the actual practices that I'm trying to get at here in the paper and this project. I actually tend to see the glass half full, and I published this book with Boaventura de Sousa Santos on law and globalization from below, in which the whole purpose was to try to capture through different case studies the emancipatory potential of socio-legal practices around the world, all the way from what the landless movement in Brazil has been doing to what very different country and issue immigrant rights advocates, lawyers have been doing in the U.S. to contest this hostile immigration policy both in the U.S. and Europe. So this is partly the reason why I embarked on this project and why I highlighted in this particular piece the other side of the coin. But I certainly have witnessed and actually have also done action research with indigenous peoples. Actually, I'm putting on my lawyer's hat that I think show the potential of both this legal institution of prior consultation and of the legalization of indigenous claims at large. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In the case study that I did in the Urralda, if it had not been for the use of those legal tools, meaning that the indigenous community that was heavily affected actually split into two, as it usually happens in these processes. If it had not been for the legal suit that they brought before the Constitutional Court, I think that it is safe to bet that they would have been physically and culturally annihilated, both because of the pressure from armed groups around their territory, the guerrilla groups and the Confederate group, and drug dealers, but also because that at least brought their case to international attention. What happened is that through the publicity that that particular legal case got, the struggle of the Embera people, this is the name of the indigenous people that are affected in this particular project, became visible in the global north. So Canadian organizations, US organizations, European organizations started to pay attention and to send letters to the colonial government that I would argue made all the difference in terms of allowing these particular communities to survive as opposed to being annihilated. They're in very bad shape, and there's a constant struggle to try to push forward their legal claims and also their political claims, and they're doing a great job at that, but they've been decimated. So it's in a counterfactual would be that without that particular use of the law, they would have disappeared, right? And then there is another case, quick example, comes from the Peruvian situation in 2009. Interestingly, and that's another connection to global sociology and global globalization at large, the protests over the lack of prior consultation to indigenous organizations and communities in the Peruvian Amazon in 2009 were the result of the Peruvian government and the Peruvian Congress's decisions to pass a number of laws that were the result, in turn, of commitments that Peru had made in the context of the free trade agreement with the U.S. So Peru had to pass laws in order to comply with the free trade agreement. And and these are very powerful forces. One, the force of unconditionally free trade, neoliberalism writ large. Then the pressure from the U.S. government, and then the pressure from the national companies with heavy investments in those territories. So these are formidable forces to tackle. The only effective tool that turned out to level the playing field was the use of a very procedural, sort of legalistic argument, which is prior consultation. So, although it's hard to tell whether this qualifies as emancipation, but emancipation relative to what? To what alternatives? That's always the question. It's not revolution. It's a revolution certainly, but many of these indigenous peoples are making things that are quite different from the ones that used to define emancipation in the progressive movement 20, 50 years ago. So that's the bit where I'm more optimistic about these processes. But it is true that since I wanted to capture the other side of the coin, it comes sort of towards the end of the paper.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cesar. Yes, who would like to ask? Yes, Sandra.
I would like to know, has there been any referendums or vote? I don't know if the rest here knows what referendums are. Maybe you can explain a little more what they are, because I don't know if they have that in the U.S. Has there been anything like that in Colombia? Because you just mentioned the Peruvian case, and I know that the protests were a big influence for things to change in Peru, for the Congress to actually listen. But I think the Colombian case is much more complicated because of all the actors involved in these struggles. We were looking in class on Monday. We were looking at the different actors, the state, NGOs, the FARC guerrillas, activists. So I was wondering if there's any sort of referendums and stuff, and also maybe if you can elaborate a little bit more about the actors involved in these struggles, and specifically in the URA.
This is where, next time around we have to do global sociology, but also visual sociology, because I have a little animated presentation with a scale, and then on one side there's the actors for extractive capitalism, and then on the other side there's the actors for indigenous rights movement, but we'll do it next time around. But it's the actors, basically in the Colombian cases, in many other cases, it's the government tends to be on the side of international investors. That's clear, and that's the case also in Peru. What's been interesting, and then there is the international financial institutions and the corporations themselves. And then on the sort of civil society side of this clash of different projects is on the indigenous people's rights side. It's the environmental organizations have played a key role, both local and international. Then international human rights agencies, and this is where the law component comes in, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the UN system, but also the local courts, the Colombian Constitutional Court, for example. So through that process and through the intervention of these actors in alliance with indigenous peoples, the political terrain is pretty balanced at this point. I mean, these countervailing forces have made it hard for extractive capital, for the actors in extractive capitalism projects to basically to go forward without any type of visibility and without any type of consultation. And the result is that there is a situation of stalemate. Many of these cases are up for grabs. Both the URA case and the UWA case that I mentioned in the paper are basically stagnant at this point because the correlation of forces is pretty even. And then the issue of referenda. I understand referenda to mean in your question whether there have been any wider participatory processes where different actors have had a say on how these projects should be conducted. Is that the question, the idea that you have in mind when you talk about the referenda?
Yeah. My question basically is, from these cases specifically, has there been anything, referendums that that have happened in Colombia? For example, I know that I think it's 2008 in Colombia there was a referendum for some people that they were protesting about water in Colombia.
Oh, okay.
And they took that to that level. So have they taken that to that level? Because referendums, which are single ballot elections or votes, show what is the vision that other people that are not in the URA or in these valleys, what do they think? Especially middle class people in Colombia.
Sure.
So.
Sure. Okay. Yes, I think there have not been any such referenda in Colombia, but other environmental cases have exploded over the last couple of years that do not involve indigenous peoples, but rather urban communities and then some landowners in the outskirts of major cities. They have asked for referenda, and as a means to open up participatory processes, but no such process has taken place so far.
Okay, thank you.
Very good. Who would like to go next? All right, I'm going to go next. All right. Yeah, 2 weeks ago, Amita Babiskar was talking to us about similar sorts of struggles in India. And she drew a distinction between struggles in the urban arena, in which sort of the middle class projects were basically presented in the sort of the idiom of environmentalism, but were very much pursuing a sort of exclusion and disempowerment of many of the urban marginal populations. And she contrasted that with the rural areas where she claimed that the balance of forces was in fact becoming more in line with the dispossessed peasantry, forces that were sort of opposed to deforestation, the reclamation of land. And she was arguing, of course, it was actually the legal framework that was giving power to the most subjugated populations in the rural areas. And I'm wondering if there's anything parallel, if you can draw any parallels with Latin America, or particularly with Colombia, in the struggles of the character you're talking about in the urban and the rural areas. And whether, and my bigger question is there something specific to Latin America? You spend your time running around the world here. So, I mean, and looking at these struggles, is there something specific to Latin America as compared with other places that you visited, Africa or India?
What's specific about Latin America is the existence and the legal force of this particular institution. Because out of the 22 countries that have ratified the ILO Convention 169, if I remember correctly, 19 are from Latin America. And that's because of a historical coincidence. This ILO Convention was issued in 1989, and then that was the beginning, just by historical coincidence, of a new wave of constitutions in Latin America. So the new constitution in 1991, which is not so new because it's already 20 years old, but it's a 1991 constitution in Colombia, so basically incorporated the key provisions, the key articles from the ILO Convention 169 into the constitutional text. And likewise in the constitutions that came after all the constitutional reforms in the 1990s and then the 2000s in Latin America. So there was a cascade phenomenon going on here. So the legal force of these arguments is a lot greater in Latin America. But of course the conflicts are very similar. When I was in South Africa, the stories that I would hear are very similar. They would be, activists and scholars would be very interested about this exotic figure of prior consultation, because they say, well, we've never used that particular framework, but now that might become an issue of global salience and usefulness, because the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights incorporates something similar to the right to prior consultation. And in fact, it goes a step further by timidly but still clearly speaking about prior consent as a standard that would be needed before large development projects take place or military operations take place in indigenous territories. So through the UN declaration, I think this particular institution will sort of be diffused around the world. Now, on the issue of urban versus rural, I think that resonates a lot with the situations that I've witnessed in Latin America. And certainly, through this historical short circuit, the sort of vanguard of the environmentalist movement are indigenous peoples. So, and the social groups making the strongest anti-capitalist sort of cosmopolitan claims are indigenous peoples, which are supposed to be pre-modern. So this is a coalition of pre-modern, so to speak, quote-unquote, and postmodern social movement, the environmental movement. And in between, there are all kinds of modern actors and institutions that compose what I call the extractive capitalism project.
Good. Okay. Yes, Catherine.
Hi. I was just going to say, the last couple of weeks of this course have been really focused on this idea of a counter movement. And specifically, a lot of people have been arguing that, in Polanyi's original formulation, he had this idea of very nationally based counter movements. But a lot of people have been saying, because capital and capitalism is a global phenomenon, that a real successful counter movement has to be global in nature. And I was just wondering, because it seems to be coming up throughout your argument, if you could speak more generally about what role do you think that international legislation and the law plays in, if any, plays in a global counter movement?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I think it plays a big role. And it plays a big role for normative and for empirical reasons. For normative reasons, the effect of these legal frameworks on the ground can be huge. When you, as a progressive constitutional court judge in Colombia or in Peru or the Supreme Court in India or this very progressive constitutional court of South Africa, refer to the existence of international legal frameworks and say, well, it's not just me protecting the rights of these marginalized communities or these slum dwellers of these indigenous peoples, but it's the UN in Geneva, or it's the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights in Washington, and you name it. Then it makes your normative argument a lot stronger. It legitimizes your normative argument and gives you leverage. So that's key. And that's, international relations scholars have theorized this and have brought to the surface the moral authority of these instruments as a key, as an emerging consensus at the transnational level about basic norms of human decency, of respect, of equality, of non-discrimination. So that's key, and I think that's at play in this case. And then at the empirical level, well, I've spent a lot of time with indigenous lawyers and indigenous leaders, and I've accompanied them through to different venues. The Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, the Geneva hearings of the Committee Against Racial Discrimination, and so on and so forth. And in those places, in those occasions, invoking the power of those legal instruments is key. And it is a lot harder, at least for a country that cares about rule of law and not being an international pariah. Those arguments can be powerful vis-a-vis a government representative, even or the representative of a corporation. So it helps decelerate, it helps level the playing field, but of course within limits. It's not like the international legal framework is going to revolutionize the world by itself. With Boaz Santos, who's written about this, and he's written about this for his whole life, and the need for legal strategies to be backed up, supported by political strategies in order to have any effectiveness. Mm-hmm.
Billy?
Hello. So, my question, in its war kind of over the apparatus of violence, the state needs to produce citizens or legal subjects. And you seem to suggest that FARC and the paramilitaries make the state and legal proceduralism seem more reasonable or less violent to indigenous communities. And so, I guess this question revolves around, as for the indigenous elders encouraging their youth to attend law school, is it that for these elders it's a case of kind of lesser evils, or choosing between the state's slow annihilation versus the paramilitary's faster annihilation, and just so it's like an issue of survival, or is there something else at stake within the dynamics of indigenous communities there?
Mm-hmm. That's a really tough question. That's a great question too, because it speaks to several issues that are complicated for indigenous communities located in the midst of a civil war, right? I've had long conversations with the different indigenous and Afro-descendant leaders exactly about this issue. Well, why cooperate with a state, with a legal framework that has served traditionally as a means for oppression, right? And that, a traditional leftist argument would say, well, that's superstructural, that if you use those tools, then you're going to get co-opted, right? And they're very aware of those risks. But as you just said, they're also very aware of the risks of going down other paths. Because actually, armed actors both on the right and the left have killed dozens of indigenous peoples in these territories. So the FARC, it's not a matter of the paramilitary right-wing squad being for the foreign investors, and then the FARC defending the people's rights. No, because these are the claims that the indigenous peoples are making, and I guess that this is similar to what Michael was referring to in the context of rural India, are inimical to all types of predatory development projects. With drug trafficking, in which both guerrilla groups and paramilitary units are very interested, because that's where they derive most of their profits, and also legal mining operations authorized by the state. So, in this very volatile, complex political game of chess, what they figured is that the law can offer at least some useful tools to advance these claims. Now, there also, at least the people and the leaders of the communities that I work with and most closely, are very aware of the shortcomings. And it's a constant contradiction and a constant. That's why in the paper I talk about the displacement effect and also the miscommunication effect. Because it's like using an instrument that doesn't quite fit with what you're trying to say. If you want to say, I do not want any type of economic exploitation in these territories, because then the water sources will be annihilated over a period of 5 years. Or then if you dig for gold, you're going to ruin their water sources. That type of claim is hard to put in procedural terms. What you have to say is, well, I was not adequately notified of the hearing that was going to take place. Or the government representative who showed up is not legally authorized to represent the government in this particular meeting. Well, those arguments may be powerful in the particular context of the consultation processes, but are not exactly the substantive claims that many of the indigenous peoples want to make.
Yes, so what you're saying is is that the only strategy the indigenous peoples have, is basically to go along with the law? What alternatives do they have?
Well, they have, in the very same countries that I've studied, they've also resorted to direct action. Direct action meaning, for example, and it doesn't quite come out in the paper, but in the book manuscript that I just finished, that sort of offers a more detailed case study of that particular conflict and a couple others, I highlight the fact that at the same time that they were going to court, they were walking, as a people, all the way from northern Colombia to Bogota, and picketing the the Colombian Ministry of the Environment. The Embera people became very visible and well known in Colombian circles, because in the late 1990s they spent 1 month over Christmas time in front and actually camping outside the Colombian Ministry of the Environment, and they've done that many times. And so marches, picket lines, civil disobedience, all that has been tried. And this is why it's key, and I'm glad you bring this point up, because it's key to not to give the impression that this is all about legal instruments without any political mobilization going hand in hand with it.
So the effectiveness operating within the legal field depends upon some sort of extra field mobilization.
Definitely.
Yeah, and of course the field is also trapped between FARC and the paramilitary, right?
Exactly, because the political field is not open for you to grab it. Other very powerful actors already have a hold of it, and but these are the forces that the indigenous peoples are up against.
Yeah. Who would like to ask our last question? Yes, Aaron.
Okay. So I'm graduating in less than 2 weeks in sociology and rhetoric. And so my second degree is in rhetoric. So I feel like this question is more rhetorical than sociological, but I hope that you indulge me, because I'm going to go into sociology after this. This may be my last rhetorical question as a rhetoric major. So I had a difficult time with ethnicity.gov, and I find it to be a woolly and muddy concept. And I found it to be sort of problematic for 4 reasons. The first is that it is already, it relies as its reference, an already vague concept, right? Ethnicity.inc as its bedfellow. Second, it presupposes that the social category ethnicity is sort of non-problematic and doesn't require clarification. And third, it relies on this counterintuitive distinction between governance and government. And then four, it depends on a kind of queer relationship to the internet, which you still didn't quite explain in your article, rather than relying on maybe the language provided by like legal frameworks, whatever they may be. I'm not a legal scholar. So to me, it sort of obfuscated more than it allowed to illuminate what was sort of going on the ground empirically, which was very rich. And so I wonder if there might be other sort of options, like maybe socio-legal subjectivity transformation, that might provide a sense of both this presupposition of the legal subject and then also the transformation of the legal subject. So I guess my questions would be, am I missing something? The second would be, how have others received the term? How has the scholarly community responded? And third, have you thought of any alternatives yourself?
Mm-hmm. Thanks. No, I appreciate that a lot. I see that you already became a sociologist because in the third and fourth points, you're asking for little understandings of the words, like the internet. You want a more precise use of the internet conventions. And also, this is the idea of a government versus governance seems to be too vague, if I understand your question there. I actually use the internet, both the play with the term of ethnicity.inc and then the use of the internet convention in a very rhetorical way, actually. That's I wanted to be.
Well said, Cesar. Throw rhetorics back at Aaron.
I wanted to deliberately be provocative, but still, of course, I'm a sociologist, and I also studied with Eric Wright. You have to remember that he taught me to be rigorous about my concepts, so I take that on heart. So let me answer with a couple of comments. This is very helpful. The question about ethnicity, the category of ethnicity, of course, is huge, right? It would take me many steps back in my argument to clarify exactly what I mean by ethnicity and so on and so forth. So I would rather not go there, but you're absolutely right. Especially the comment that I have gotten is the question that I've gotten many times is whether what I say about indigenous peoples apply to other ethnic communities, so as to justify my use of ethnicity as an umbrella concept. And I think that's a good question that I'm trying to grapple with in the book manuscript, and that's key. Now, the issue of government versus governance, that's actually pretty standard in the literature. The idea that there is government, there's governance without government, meaning that there's regulation of social life without the presence of the nation state. That's basically the substantive point. And this is key to my argument because, as I mentioned in my presentation, I'm arguing that this social field is being regulated not just by states or interstate agencies, but also by private actors like the transnational companies in their codes of conduct, by the World Bank, and so on and so forth. So that's the bit. And finally, the idea of the Internet Convention. That's, of course, that's when rhetoric comes in, because I really wanted to play with those words. That's pretty much it. Although I did want, of course, there's a substantive point behind it, which is a substantive claim that the process of ethnicity.inc runs parallel to a simultaneous process of regulation of ethnicity. And fleshing out that process, the contours, the actors of that process is the object of my paper and the book man. But I think that you're absolutely right about the complications. Now it's a matter of also of coming out with a better term, but that's something I might want to think about.
Very good, very good. Well, we're going to have to wait for the book, I guess.
Yes.
Very good. Is it coming out soon?
Well, with the U.S. publishers, this is where the Global South has the lead because it's a lot faster for me to get it published in Spanish because there's not much of a queue. Actually wrote it in English, and it's now in the process of being translated into Spanish, but because of the editorial times, it'll probably take longer to do it in English, have it published in English. But I believe in online resources, so I'll post the whole thing up on my web before it's published, and that's what Eric does, and he gets away with it. So.
Right. That's right. Of course, in the South, you've got a much more powerful public sociology, so, things are published much more rapidly. In the North, we're all so professionalized. Yes, right. Well, anyway, rhetoric or no rhetoric, following on our end, we're really very impressed that here we have, somebody who actually does on-the-ground field research, who engages with these different groups, very dangerous groups, some of them, but also traces the connections in a vertical manner through the legal field, as opposed to these speculative transnational counter movements that we really can't discover. You've really given us a sort of a sense of a alternative global sociology that perhaps is not totally transformative, but actually becomes a powerful defense for the interests of indigenous communities. So this was really very, very great for you to come here and talk with us and to give us a sort of vision of an alternative vision of global sociology. So thank you very much, Cesar.